The plane cabin was tense. All eyes were on the blonde-haired woman in first class, who had just shouted something shocking at the tall black soldier standing in the aisle. "I don't want to sit next to him," she bellowed, her voice sharp and filled with disgust. "This is first class. Get him out of here." Gasps rippled through the cabin and whispers started immediately. The soldier, dressed in his neatly pressed uniform, looked stunned but stood his ground. His nameplate read Johnson, and the badge on his chest gleamed under the cabin lights. He didn't say a word, just clenched his jaw as the flight attendant rushed to de-escalate the situation. The woman sneered. "I paid for this seat, and I shouldn't have to share it with someone like that." The flight attendant's voice wavered as she tried to reason with the woman. "Ma'am, Surgeon Johnson has every right to sit here. He's a paying passenger just like you." "I don't care." The woman snapped, loud enough for everyone to hear. "He can go to the back where he belongs." The silence was deafening. Surgeon Johnson, still calm, nodded toward the flight attendant and quietly said, "It's okay. I'll move." Before he could take a step, another passenger stood up, a tall, gray-haired man wearing a suit. "No, you won't," he said firmly. His voice carried authority, and the cabin seemed to hold its breath. The woman's face flushed as she realized she had lost control of the situation. But no one could have predicted what happened next. The plane's captain emerged from the cockpit, his face tight with anger. He pointed directly at the woman. "Ma'am, you're getting off this plane." Her eyes widened in disbelief. "What? You can't do that. I paid for this seat." "Security is already on the way," the captain said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You're not flying with us today." The woman sputtered in protest, but the sight of two uniformed officers boarding the plane silenced her. As they escorted her off, a wave of applause broke out among the passengers. But what came next would shock her even more, and it wouldn't take long to make headlines. The story started earlier that day, long before the flight took off. Surgeon James Johnson was heading home after an 8-month deployment overseas. His heart ached for his family, his wife, Angela, and their 6-year-old daughter, Kayla. He could already picture Kayla's wide smile when she ran into his arms at the airport. James had chosen to fly first class, using the last of his deployment savings. It was a small indulgence after months of grueling conditions. He deserved it, or so he thought. Meanwhile, Madison Green was preparing for her own flight. She was used to being catered to, with her designer luggage and perfectly styled hair. To her, first class was more than just a seat. It was a symbol of her status. She boarded the plane early, sinking into the leather seat with a smug smile, and didn't bother to glance at the other passengers filing past her. James boarded shortly after. He moved through the aisle, nodding politely to the passengers who met his eye. When he reached his seat, he hesitated for a moment, noticing the icy glare from the woman next to him. But he dismissed it and stowed his bag overhead. Madison had noticed him immediately, and her mood darkened. She whispered something under her breath as he settled into his seat, but James ignored her. He was used to dealing with difficult people. Then came the drink service. James asked for water, while Madison ordered wine. When the flight attendant handed James his drink first, Madison scowled. "Excuse me," she said loudly. "Aren't you supposed to serve first-class passengers first?" The attendant, flustered, apologized and moved on. But Madison wasn't done. She glared at James and muttered, "Probably doesn't even belong here." James turned to her, his voice calm but firm. "Ma'am, I paid for this seat just like you." That was when Madison snapped, and the scene unfolded as it did. The shouting, the insults, and the captain's swift intervention. As security led her off the plane, James sat back in his seat, still processing the whirlwind of events. He hadn't expected the passengers' applause or the murmurs of support. Some even stopped by his seat to thank him for his service. It was a small comfort after what had just happened. As the plane prepared for takeoff, James closed his eyes, hoping to put the incident behind him. But in less than 24 hours, Madison Green would wake up to news that would leave her reeling, and James would find himself at the center of a much larger story. The next morning, Madison Green awoke in her luxury apartment, still seething about the events on the plane. She had spent the night drafting an angry email to the airline, demanding an apology for her unfair treatment. Her version of the story painted her as the victim, conveniently leaving out her insults and loud demands. She scrolled through her phone, sipping coffee and muttering to herself. But as she opened her favorite social media app, her stomach dropped. Her face was everywhere. A passenger on the flight had recorded the entire incident. The video, only a few minutes long, showed Madison yelling at Surgeon Johnson, calling him names, and insisting he go to the back where he belongs. The video ended with her being escorted off the plane, her face a mask of shock and fury. The video had gone viral overnight. The hashtags #RespectOurTroops and #RacistKaren were trending, and Madison's name was plastered across the internet. Comment sections were brutal. People were calling her out, tagging her accounts, and even digging into her past. By mid-morning, she was the internet's most hated person. Her phone buzzed with a call from her boss. Madison hesitated but answered, her voice shaky. "Madison," her boss said coldly, "we've seen the video. This behavior does not reflect our company's values. You're suspended indefinitely and effective immediately." "Wait, you can't do this," Madison exclaimed. "That video doesn't tell the whole story." Her boss cut her off. "The whole story doesn't matter. We can't have someone like you representing us. Goodbye." The line went dead, and Madison sat frozen, her coffee forgotten. She had no idea how bad things were about to get. Meanwhile, Surgeon Johnson was unaware of the storm brewing online. He had landed safely and reunited with his family the previous night. His wife, Angela, had been waiting with Kayla, who practically flew into his arms the moment she saw him. It was the moment James had been dreaming about for months, and nothing could ruin it. That morning, Angela noticed something strange as she scrolled through her phone. Her feed was filled with messages about a video featuring James. Confused, she clicked on the link. "James," she called out, her voice a mix of concern and confusion. "Come here. You need to see this." James walked over, holding Kayla in his arms. He watched the video in silence, his expression unreadable. When it ended, he sighed and handed Angela the phone. "I didn't want this kind of attention," he said quietly. "I just wanted to come home." Angela hugged him. "You didn't do anything wrong, James. People are supporting you because you deserve it." As the morning went on, James' phone started ringing nonstop. News outlets, friends, even strangers were reaching out. His social media accounts, which had been dormant for months, were flooded with messages of gratitude and admiration. One message stood out. It was from a well-known journalist, asking James to appear on a national morning show to share his story. Angela urged him to accept, but James was hesitant. "I'm not a hero," he said. "I just wanted to get home." Angela smiled. "You stood your ground, James. That's what makes you a hero." Back in her apartment, Madison's day was going from bad to worse. Reporters were camped outside her building, and she had to turn off her phone to stop the flood of angry messages. Even her closest friends were distancing themselves, afraid of being associated with her. Desperate, Madison called her lawyer. "You have to help me," she begged. "This is ruining my life." Her lawyer sighed. "Madison, the best thing you can do right now is apologize publicly. Take responsibility." Madison bristled at the suggestion. "Apologize? For what? I didn't do anything wrong." "People saw the video," her lawyer said bluntly. "Denying it will only make things worse. Do you want to salvage what's left of your reputation?" Madison didn't answer. She couldn't bring herself to admit she was wrong. The next morning, James decided to accept the invitation to the morning show. He hoped it would be an opportunity to set the record straight and shift the focus away from the drama. He didn't want Madison's behavior to overshadow the sacrifices made by men and women in uniform. When the segment aired, James spoke calmly and graciously. He recounted the incident without malice, emphasizing the importance of kindness and understanding. By the end of the interview, the hosts were visibly moved, and the audience erupted in applause. As James left the studio, He received a call from the airline. They apologized profusely for what had happened and offered him a free first-class ticket for his next flight, along with a generous voucher for his family. James thanked them but insisted that the flight attendants had done their best in a tough situation. Madison watched the interview from her couch, her face pale. James' dignity and grace only made her look worse. For the first time, she felt a pang of guilt. But as the public outcry against her intensified, she realized that guilt alone wouldn't be enough to fix the damage she had done. Her next move would decide her fate, but it wouldn't come easily. By the afternoon, Madison's face was splashed across every major news outlet. The phrase, "go to the back where he belongs," had become a rallying cry for justice against discrimination. And she was the target. Even her lawyer, who had initially encouraged her to apologize, was now ignoring her calls. Madison sat in her living room, blinds drawn and TV off. Her laptop sat open on the coffee table, displaying hundreds of unanswered emails, most of them hateful. She felt trapped, isolated, and panicked. Her life was crumbling, and the walls of her once comfortable world were closing in. James, on the other hand, was beginning to see the ripple effect of his unexpected spotlight. He spent the day fielding calls from strangers who wanted to thank him. Veterans groups offered their support, and local organizations reached out, eager to celebrate his service. A nearby university invited him to speak at a Veterans Appreciation event, and a children's hospital asked if he would visit to inspire young patients. James was overwhelmed by the attention, but Angela reminded him that this was a chance to show Kayla what strength and humility looked like. "People are looking up to you," she said as she gently placed her hand on his shoulder. And Kayla is seeing her dad stand tall in the face of adversity. That's something she'll carry with her forever. Meanwhile, Madison's story took an unexpected turn when one of her former classmates from high school came forward with a long thread on social media. The classmate described how Madison had bullied her for years because of her race. She included old yearbook photos and text messages to back up her claims. The thread went viral within hours, adding fuel to the fire. Madison's name was now synonymous with privilege and bigotry. The airline issued a public statement, confirming that Madison had been banned from flying with them indefinitely. They'd also pledged to implement anti-discrimination training for their staff and create a policy to address similar incidents in the future. Public opinion applauded the airline's swift action, while Madison's reputation sank even lower. James was unaware of the mounting backlash against Madison. He was focused on keeping his life as normal as possible for his family. That evening, as he tucked Kayla into bed, she asked him a question that caught him off guard. "Daddy, why did that lady not like you?" James paused, searching for the right words. "Sometimes people don't understand that everyone is special, no matter what they look like," he said gently. "But what matters is how we treat people, even when they're not kind to us." Kayla nodded thoughtfully. "You were kind, Daddy. You didn't yell back." James kissed her forehead, his heart heavy but proud. "I'm glad you noticed, sweetheart." The next day, James received a surprising invitation. A local community group wanted to honor him at an upcoming event where they planned to present him with an award for his service and his grace under pressure. They insisted that his actions on the plane had inspired countless people. James hesitated. "I'm not sure I deserve all this attention," he told Angela. "I was just trying to get home." Angela smiled. "You deserve it, James. People see you as a symbol of hope. Accepting this award isn't just about you. It's about showing the world what integrity looks like." Reluctantly, James agreed. The ceremony was scheduled for the following weekend, and Angela helped him prepare a short speech. Back in her apartment, Madison reached her breaking point. She knew she couldn't avoid the public forever. The pressure to apologize was unbearable, but she struggled with how to frame it. Her lawyer finally returned her call and gave her one last piece of advice. "Madison, if you're going to do this, you need to be honest. Don't just apologize because people expect you to. Admit your mistakes and show that you're willing to change." Madison hated the idea of groveling, but she had no other options. She decided to release a video apology, It took her hours to record as she stumbled over her words and fought back tears. In the final version, she said, "I want to start by saying I'm sorry to Surgeon Johnson and to everyone who was hurt or offended by my actions. There's no excuse for what I said, and I'm ashamed of how I behaved. I've realized that my words were not only hurtful but also reflective of biases I need to confront and change. I promise to do the work necessary to become a better person." She posted the video late that night, and within minutes, the comments began pouring in. Some people were cautiously forgiving, while others dismissed her apology as insincere. The damage was too deep for a single video to repair. The day of the community event arrived, and James felt a mix of nerves and gratitude as he stepped onto the stage. The room was packed with people from all walks of life, all there to celebrate his courage. As James accepted the award, he looked out at the crowd and said, "I didn't expect any of this. I just wanted to get home to my family. But I've learned that even small moments of standing up for what's right can make a difference. I hope we can all work toward a world where kindness and respect are the norm, not the exception." The applause was thunderous, and James felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in days. But just as the event concluded, James received a phone call that would change everything once again. The person on the other end of the line introduced themselves as a producer from a major news network. "Surgeon Johnson," they said, "we'd like to invite you to participate in a special televised discussion on race and respect in America. And we have an unusual request. Madison Green has agreed to join the discussion as well. Would you be willing to sit down with her?" James' hand tightened around the phone as he considered the implications. It was an opportunity to address the issue head-on, but was he ready to confront the woman who had tried to humiliate him? James sat in the quiet of his living room, staring at his phone. The producer's words echoed in his mind. "Madison Green has agreed to join the discussion. Would you be willing to sit down with her?" It was an opportunity to stand up for his principles in front of a national audience. But it also meant facing her again, reliving the moment that had turned his life upside down. Angela placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "What are you thinking?" she asked softly. "I don't know," James admitted. "Part of me feels like I should do it. But another part of me wonders what good it would do. What if it just gives her a platform to make excuses?" Angela nodded thoughtfully. "You have a chance to speak your truth and show people how to respond with dignity. If you decide to do this, it's not for her. It's for you and everyone watching." James thought about Kayla and the lessons he wanted to teach her. He took a deep breath and called the producer back. "I'll do it," he said firmly. The day of the televised discussion arrived quickly. The set was sleek and modern, with 2 chairs positioned on a stage under bright lights. The host, a well-known journalist named Lisa Morgan, greeted James warmly as he arrived. "We're so grateful you agreed to this," she said. "This conversation is important." James nodded. "I just hope it makes a difference." Madison arrived shortly after. She looked pale and nervous, her usual air of confidence replaced by an uneasy fidgeting. When her eyes met James, she quickly looked away. The show began with Lisa summarizing the events that had brought them to this moment, showing the now infamous video clip to the audience. As it played, James kept his expression neutral, but Madison shifted uncomfortably in her chair. When the video ended, Lisa turned to Madison. "You've seen this clip many times by now," she said. "What goes through your mind when you watch it?" Madison swallowed hard. "I feel ashamed," she said quietly. "I see someone I don't recognize, someone who let ignorance and anger take over. I'm deeply sorry for what I said and did." Lisa nodded and turned to James. "Surgeon Johnson, this incident has sparked a national conversation. What do you want people to take away from this?" James paused, choosing his words carefully. "I want people to understand that our words and actions have power. We can use that power to build each other up or tear each other down. I hope we can all choose kindness and respect, even when it's difficult." The discussion moved on to broader topics of racism and accountability. Madison admitted that she had grown up in an environment where prejudices were normalized, but she emphasized her commitment to unlearning those biases. "I've started working with organizations that educate people about racism," she said. "It's been humbling, but I know I have a long way to go." James listened intently but remained skeptical. He appreciated her willingness to speak openly, but he knew that real change required more than words. At one point, Lisa asked Madison directly, "What would you say to Surgeon Johnson now, face to face?" Madison turned to James, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry. Truly. You didn't deserve the way I treated you. I can't take back what I said, but I hope you'll believe that I'm trying to be better." James met her gaze, his expression calm but serious. "I appreciate your apology," he said. "Change takes time and effort, and I hope you'll follow through on what you've said today." After the discussion ended, James and Madison were escorted backstage. Madison hesitated before approaching him. "Thank you for agreeing to do this," she said. "I know I don't deserve your kindness." James nodded. "It's not about what you deserve. It's about what we can learn from this." Madison blinked back tears, realizing the depth of his words. "I'll keep working on myself," she promised. "I mean that." James offered a small, polite smile. "Good luck." The televised discussion was a success, sparking thoughtful conversations across the country. Many viewers praised James for his grace and humility, while others debated whether Madison's apology was genuine. As James returned home that evening, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He had faced the storm head-on and come out stronger. Angela hugged him tightly, and Kayla looked up at him with wide eyes. "Did you win, Daddy?" she asked. James smiled and crouched down to her level. "It's not about winning or losing, sweetie. It's about doing what's right." But just as James began to settle back into normal life, another unexpected twist loomed on the horizon. A letter arrived in the mail, addressed to him in neat handwriting. Inside was a heartfelt note from Madison's father, apologizing on her behalf and revealing a surprising connection that would challenge everything James thought he knew about her. James sat at the dining table, the letter in his hands. The handwriting was careful, almost formal, and the words jumped off the page with every read. Madison Green's father, David Green, had written to him, apologizing for his daughter's behavior and sharing something that caught James completely off guard. David's letter began with a sincere apology. He expressed deep regret for the pain Madison had caused and admitted he had been part of the problem. "I raised her in an environment that didn't teach respect for everyone, regardless of their background," he wrote. "For that, I take full responsibility." The letter took a shocking turn in the second paragraph. David revealed that he had served in the military many years ago and had fought alongside black soldiers. "I wasn't perfect back then," he admitted, "but those men taught me more about honor and courage than I could have learned anywhere else." He continued, "When I saw the video of Madison's behavior, I felt sick. It was a painful reminder of how I had failed her. But what you need to know, Surgeon Johnson, is that my father, Madison's grandfather, was a decorated soldier who fought in World War II. He served in the all-black 761st Tank Battalion, a group known as the Black Panthers. He faced unimaginable racism, even while fighting for a country that didn't fully accept him." James sat back stunned. Madison's grandfather had been part of a historic unit, one of the first black battalions to see combat in World War II. It was a piece of history that Madison herself had likely never known or understood. Angela walked in, noticing the look on James' face. "What's wrong?" she asked. James handed her the letter. As she read it, her eyes widened. "Wow," she whispered. "That's unexpected. It changes things, doesn't it?" James said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Her family has a history of service and sacrifice, and yet she acted the way she did." Angela nodded slowly. "It makes you wonder how much of that history was passed down or ignored." That evening, James found himself reflecting on David Green's words. He felt a strange mix of emotions: anger at Madison's ignorance, sympathy for her father's remorse, and a deep respect for the sacrifices made by the 761st Tank Battalion. He decided to research more about the battalion, immersing himself in their stories of bravery and perseverance. The next day, James reached out to David, thanking him for the letter. They spoke on the phone for nearly an hour, discussing everything from their shared military experiences to the complexities of raising children in a divided world. David confessed that he hadn't spoken to Madison since the incident, unsure of how to bridge the gap between them. "She's stubborn, like her mother," David said with a wry chuckle. "But I'm hoping this experience will open her eyes." James listened carefully, then said, "Sometimes people need a wake-up call. She got one. What she does with it is up to her." Unbeknownst to James, Madison had found her grandfather's military records after their televised discussion. Inspired by the backlash she had faced and her father's insistence that she learn about her family's past, she began digging into her grandfather's history. She discovered letters he had written during the war, describing the racism he endured both on and off the battlefield. One letter stood out. "They call us soldiers when they need us and something else when they don't. But we fight anyway, not for them, but for what this country could be someday." The words hit Madison like a punch to the gut. She realized how deeply her ignorance ran and how little she understood about the struggles of people like her grandfather and Sergeant Johnson. A week later, James received another unexpected call. This time, it was from Madison herself. Her voice was shaky, but there was a genuine sincerity in her tone. "Sergeant Johnson," she began, "I've been learning about my grandfather. I didn't even know he served in an all-black battalion until recently. I wanted to say thank you for your patience, for showing me what grace looks like." James was silent for a moment, then said, "Learning is a good first step, Madison. What you do next is what matters most." "I know," she replied. "I want to do better." Madison's journey to redemption wasn't easy. She started attending workshops on racial bias, volunteered with organizations that supported veterans, and even visited schools to talk about the importance of understanding history. Meanwhile, James was contacted by a documentary filmmaker who wanted to tell the story of the 761st Tank Battalion and connect it to the events that had unfolded on the plane. The project would feature interviews with surviving members of the battalion, as well as James' perspective as a modern-day soldier. As James considered the offer, he thought about the legacy of those who came before him and the lessons they had passed down. He decided to participate, hoping to honor their sacrifices and inspire future generations. On the day of the first documentary shoot, James was surprised to see Madison among the crew. She wasn't there as a star but as a volunteer, carrying equipment and assisting behind the scenes. When their eyes met, she gave him a small, tentative smile. James nodded in acknowledgement, recognizing that she was taking steps, however small, toward becoming the person she wanted to be. But just as things seemed to settle, another challenge arose. The filmmaker uncovered a long-lost journal from Madison's grandfather, containing details of a specific mission that had been covered up for decades. The contents of the journal would spark controversy, forcing James and Madison to confront a new wave of questions about justice, truth, and the untold stories of history. The filmmaker, Claire Bennett, placed the journal on the table like it was a rare artifact. The leather cover was worn and cracked, the pages filled with faded handwriting. Madison and James sat across from her, their eyes fixed on the object that seemed to pulse with the weight of history. "This journal belonged to Madison's grandfather," Claire began. "It details a mission carried out by the 761st Tank Battalion during World War II. But here's the twist. This mission was never officially recorded in military archives. According to the entries, the battalion was sent on a dangerous operation behind enemy lines, and their success was intentionally buried by higher-ups." James leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "Why would they bury it?" Claire sighed. "The entries suggest it was a combination of racial prejudice and political motives. The higher-ups didn't want to give credit to an all-black unit for pulling off something so significant. It's the kind of story that would have rewritten history books, if anyone had cared enough to tell it." Madison, still processing the revelation, reached for the journal. She flipped through the pages, her grandfather's handwriting weaving a narrative of bravery, camaraderie, and heartbreak. One passage caught her eye. "We were sent into hell with no backup and no real plan, But we did it anyway. We saved lives that day, people who will never know our names. And when we returned, we were told to keep quiet. They said it was for the greater good, but all I felt was betrayal. Madison's voice trembled as she read it aloud. He must have been so hurt, she whispered. To fight for a country that didn't even acknowledge his sacrifice. James nodded solemnly. That was the reality for so many black soldiers. They gave everything, knowing they might never be recognized. Claire explained her vision for the documentary. She wanted to center the story around the journal, giving a voice to the soldiers of the 761st who had been silenced for decades. She hoped the project would spark a movement to have their achievements officially recognized by the military. We'll need both of you to be part of this, Claire said, looking at James and Madison. James is someone who continues the legacy of these soldiers, and Madison as someone who's connected to this history, but is still learning how to honor it. James hesitated. He had never considered himself a storyteller or an activist, but he saw the potential impact of sharing this story. I'm in, he said firmly. Those men deserve to be remembered. Madison, still holding the journal, nodded. I want to do this, she said. For my grandfather. For all of them. The filming process was intense. Claire interviewed surviving members of the 761st Tank Battalion, who were now in their 90s, as well as historians who had studied their contributions. James visited the sites of significant battles, reflecting on the sacrifices made by soldiers who had paved the way for him. Madison, meanwhile, immersed herself in her grandfather's writings, piecing together the man he had been and the legacy he had left behind. One particularly emotional moment came when Claire filmed James and Madison visiting her grandfather's grave. Madison knelt by the headstone, her voice breaking as she spoke. I'm so sorry I didn't understand your story sooner, she said. But I promise I'll do everything I can to make sure people know what you and your brothers in arms did. James stood beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. We're all learning, he said gently. What matters is what we do with that knowledge. As the documentary neared completion, Claire uncovered more troubling details about the cover-up. Official records show that several members of the 761st had been denied medals they had earned during the mission described in the journal. The military had cited technical errors as the reason, but the journal painted a different picture. Madison read an entry aloud during one of the filming sessions. They handed out medals to the white units that came in after us, while we stood in the background. It was like we didn't exist, but we knew the truth. We were the first ones there. We were the reason they survived. Claire decided to include this revelation in the documentary, hoping it would pressure the military to revisit the case. James agreed, though he warned her about potential backlash. The truth makes people uncomfortable, he said. But that doesn't mean we should stay silent. The documentary's release date was set, and the anticipation was palpable. Trailers for the film went viral, sparking renewed interest in the 761st Tank Battalion. Schools began including the battalion in their history lessons, and veterans organizations called for official recognition of their contributions. Madison felt a mix of pride and apprehension. She had come a long way since the incident on the plane, but she knew the documentary would reopen old wounds. Still, she was determined to stand by her grandfather's legacy and support the push for justice. The premiere night arrived, and the theater was packed with people from all walks of life. James and Madison sat side by side, their families in the row behind them. As the lights dimmed and the opening scenes played, James felt a surge of emotion. This wasn't just a film. It was a tribute to the men who had fought for a country that hadn't always fought for them. When the credits rolled, the audience gave a standing ovation. James and Madison were called to the stage, where they received thunderous applause. Claire joined them, holding the journal, and announced that the military had agreed to review the 761st records in light of the documentary's findings. James stepped forward, addressing the crowd. This isn't just about one battalion, he said. It's about making sure every soldier's story is told, no matter who they are. History deserves the truth. But even as the documentary gained acclaim, a new challenge emerged. A powerful political figure publicly criticized the film, claiming it unfairly targeted the military and divided Americans instead of uniting them. The backlash threatened to derail the momentum of the movement, forcing James and Madison to decide whether they were ready to fight another battle, this time for the very soul of the story they had worked so hard to tell. The backlash hit like a tidal wave. Social media lit up with polarized reactions to the documentary. While many praised its honesty and called for the military to right its wrongs, others sided with the political figure's accusations, claiming the film was an attack on patriotism and an attempt to rewrite history. James sat in his living room, his phone buzzing non-stop with messages of both support and criticism. Kayla played quietly nearby, unaware of the storm brewing outside their home. Angela watched him with concern. "You knew this might happen," she said softly, sitting beside him. "I did," James admitted. "But it's hard seeing people twist something so important into a political debate." Angela squeezed his hand. "This isn't about them. It's about the truth." Madison, on the other hand, was feeling the weight of the backlash more personally. The same people who had condemned her actions on the plane were now questioning her involvement in the documentary. Some accused her of using the project to repair her image, while others labeled her a traitor for highlighting her family's painful history. One night, she received a message from an anonymous account that shook her to her core. "Your grandfather would be ashamed of you." Tears stung her eyes as she stared at the screen. She wanted to reply to defend herself, but she knew it wouldn't make a difference. Instead, she called Claire, desperate for advice. "Keep going," Claire told her. "People will always find something to criticize, but what you're doing matters. Focus on that." The controversy reached a boiling point when the political figure, Senator Mitchell Caldwell, announced he would be hosting a televised debate to address the divisive narrative being pushed by the documentary. He invited James, Madison, and Claire to participate, along with a panel of military historians and veterans who opposed the film. Claire was reluctant. This could turn into a circus, she warned James and Madison during a phone call. Caldwell isn't interested in the truth. He just wants to score political points. James, however, saw it as an opportunity. "If we don't show up, it'll look like we're afraid to defend the story. And if we do, we might reach people who haven't made up their minds yet." Madison agreed, though she was nervous about facing Caldwell's scrutiny. "I'll do it," she said. "For my grandfather. For all of them." The debate was held in a packed studio, with millions of viewers watching from home. The stage was divided into two sides, James, Madison, and Claire on one, and Caldwell and his panel on the other. The tension in the room was palpable. The moderator opened with a question to James. "Sergeant Johnson, the documentary has sparked both admiration and criticism. What do you say to those who claim it unfairly targets the military?" James leaned forward, his voice steady. "This isn't about targeting anyone. It's about telling the truth. The soldiers of the 761st Tank Battalion served their country with honor, even when their country didn't honor them. Acknowledging that isn't an attack, it's justice." The audience applauded, but Caldwell quickly interjected. "With all due respect, Sergeant, history is complicated. Singling out one story to fit a modern agenda risks distorting the broader picture." Claire countered. "This isn't about distortion, Senator. It's about inclusion. The 761st contributions were intentionally left out of the broader picture. We're simply putting them back where they belong." Caldwell smirked. "And you think tarnishing the military's reputation is the way to do that?" Madison, who had remained quiet until now, finally spoke up. "No one's tarnishing anything. My grandfather gave his life for this country. The least we can do is tell the truth about what he and his brothers went through." Her voice wavered, but her conviction was clear. Caldwell seemed momentarily taken aback, and the audience murmured in agreement. The debate raged on, with both sides presenting their arguments. James and Madison shared excerpts from the journal, painting a vivid picture of the sacrifices made by the 761st. Caldwell and his panel pushed back, questioning the accuracy of the entries and downplaying the significance of the uncovered mission. But the turning point came when Claire revealed a key piece of evidence. A memo from a military official during World War II, instructing his superiors to suppress reports of the 761st mission. The memo, authenticated by historians, left Caldwell scrambling for a response. By the end of the debate, the mood in the room had shifted. While not everyone was convinced, it was clear that the story of the 761st had struck a chord with many viewers. That night, James received a flood of messages from people who had watched the debate. Some were veterans thanking him for standing up for the truth, while others were everyday citizens moved by the story. Madison, too, felt a glimmer of hope as messages of support trickled in. One stood out. "I didn't know my grandfather served in the 761st until I saw your documentary. Thank you for bringing this history to light." The next morning, the surprising announcement came from the Department of Defense. They would be conducting a full review of the 761st Tank Battalion's records, with the possibility of awarding posthumous medals to soldiers who had been overlooked. James read the statement aloud to Angela, his voice filled with emotion. "It's a start," he said. "They're finally listening." But even as progress was made, the battle was far from over. Caldwell vowed to continue his opposition, and new challenges loomed on the horizon. For James, Madison, and everyone who believed in the story of the 761st, the fight for justice was just beginning. The announcement from the Department of Defense ignited a wave of cautious optimism. Across the country, veterans groups and historians celebrated the possibility of long-overdue recognition for the 761st Tank Battalion. News outlets covered the story extensively, highlighting excerpts from the documentary and journal. But the backlash didn't disappear. Senator Caldwell doubled down on his opposition, accusing the Department of Defense of succumbing to political pressure and rewriting history to fit modern sensibilities. He appeared on talk shows, warning of the dangerous precedent being set. For James, the mix of progress and pushback was bittersweet. The review was a step forward, but he knew the fight wasn't over. He also worried about the toll it was taking on Madison, who had become a lightning rod for criticism. One morning, Madison called James. Her voice was shaky, and he could tell she'd been crying. "James, I don't know if I can keep doing this," she said. "Every time I think I'm making progress, someone finds a new way to attack me. I'm not strong like you." "You don't have to be strong all the time," James said gently. "But giving up won't help anyone, not your grandfather, not the soldiers of the 761st, and not you. The truth matters, Madison, and you're part of making sure it's heard." Madison was silent for a moment. "I don't know how you stay so calm," she finally said. James chuckled softly. "You think I'm calm? I get angry too. But I channel it into something meaningful. You can do the same." His words seemed to resonate. "Okay," she said quietly. "I'll keep going." As the Department of Defense's review progressed, Claire continued gathering evidence to strengthen the case for the 761st recognition. She uncovered additional letters and reports from surviving members of the battalion, painting an even clearer picture of their bravery and the systemic racism they endured. One letter, written by a young soldier shortly after the war, struck a particularly emotional chord. "We were asked to fight for freedom, but when we came home we found none. Still, I'd do it all again, because the fight wasn't just for the present, it was for the future. Maybe one day, someone will tell our story, and the world will finally see us." When Claire shared the letter with James and Madison, it left them both speechless. "It's like he was speaking to us," Madison said, her voice breaking. "We're the ones who have to make sure his words don't get forgotten." As public pressure mounted, the Department of Defense invited James, Madison, and Claire to Washington, D.C., to meet with officials overseeing the review. The meeting was a high-stakes opportunity to present their findings and advocate for the battalion's recognition. The trio prepared extensively. James rehearsed a speech emphasizing the importance of honoring the 761st contributions, while Claire compiled a comprehensive report detailing their findings. Madison, still nervous about her role, focused on sharing her personal connection to the story. When the day of the meeting arrived, they entered the Pentagon with a mix of determination and anxiety. The room was filled with military officials, historians, and advocates, all there to weigh the evidence. James spoke first. The soldiers of the 761st Tank Battalion didn't just fight for this country. They'd fought for its ideals, even when those ideals weren't extended to them. Recognizing their contributions isn't just about the past. It's about what kind of country we want to be. Madison followed, her voice steady despite her nerves. My grandfather was one of those soldiers. He risked everything for a nation that didn't see him as an equal. But he believed in a better future. Honoring him and his brothers in arms is a step toward that future. The officials listened intently, occasionally asking questions. By the end of the meeting, it was clear that the evidence had made an impact. One of the senior officials, a decorated general, thanked them personally. "You've given us a lot to consider," he said. "We owe it to these men to get this right." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of anticipation. News of the Pentagon meeting leaked to the press, sparking renewed debate. Caldwell continued his attacks, but support for the 761st grew louder. Social media campaigns, petitions, and op-eds flooded the conversation, with many calling on the government to act swiftly. Finally, the announcement came. The Department of Defense would formally recognize the 761st Tank Battalion for their contributions during World War II. A ceremony was planned to award posthumous medals to the soldiers who had been overlooked, as well as a special honor for the unit as a whole. James, Madison, and Claire were invited to the ceremony, which would be held at the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. For James, it was a moment of validation. For Madison, it was a chance to honor her grandfather in a way she never thought possible. The day of the ceremony was emotional. Families of the 761st soldiers filled the audience, many holding photographs and mementos of their loved ones. The atmosphere was a mix of celebration and reflection, as speakers recounted the battalion's bravery and sacrifices. James was invited to deliver the keynote speech. Standing at the podium, he felt the weight of history on his shoulders. "These men fought for a country that didn't always fight for them," he began. But they never let that stop them. They believed in something bigger than themselves, an idea of freedom and equality that we're still striving to achieve. Today, we honor them not just for what they did, but for what they stood for. The audience erupted in applause, many wiping away tears. Madison, sitting in the front row, held her grandfather's journal tightly in her hands. When the medals were presented, she stepped forward to accept one on his behalf. As she held the medal, she whispered, "This is for you, Grandpa." That evening, as James and Madison walked through the museum's halls, they paused at an exhibit dedicated to the 761st Tank Battalion. The display included photographs, artifacts, and a plaque detailing their historic mission. At the center was a copy of Madison's grandfather's journal, carefully preserved for future generations. "This feels right," Madison said, her voice filled with gratitude. "It feels like they're finally getting the respect they deserve." James nodded. "They're not just part of history anymore. They're part of the story we tell about who we are." But even as they celebrated this victory, James couldn't shake the feeling that their journey wasn't over. The fight for justice and equality was ongoing, and there were still untold stories waiting to be uncovered. In the weeks following the ceremony, the recognition of the 761st Tank Battalion sparked a national conversation about other overlooked stories in American history. Schools and universities began incorporating lessons on the battalion into their curriculums, and calls for further investigation into forgotten contributions by marginalized groups grew louder. For James, the aftermath was bittersweet. The battalion had finally received the honor it deserved, but the journey had reminded him of how much work was still left to do. He continued to speak at events, share his experiences, and advocate for the recognition of others whose stories had been erased. Madison, on the other hand, found herself grappling with her role in the movement. The recognition of her grandfather's battalion was a personal triumph, but the public continued to scrutinize her every move. Some applauded her efforts to honor her family's legacy, while others remained skeptical, accusing her of leveraging the story to rehabilitate her image. During a quiet moment at home, she called Claire. "I feel like no matter what I do, it's never enough," she admitted. Claire's voice was calm but firm. "That's because change takes time, Madison. It's not about proving anything to the critics. It's about staying committed to the work. If you're doing it for the right reasons, that's all that matters." One day, James received a surprising invitation from the White House. The president wanted to host an event celebrating the contributions of the 761st Tank Battalion and other overlooked military units. The invitation extended to Madison, Claire, and the families of the soldiers who had served. When James told Angela about the invitation, she smiled proudly. "You've come so far," she said. "This is exactly the kind of spotlight their story deserves." Madison was nervous about attending such a high-profile event. "What if people think I don't belong there?" she asked James during a phone call. "You belong there," James assured her. "You've earned your place just like your grandfather earned his." The event at the White House was a grand affair. The East Room was filled with veterans, historians, and advocates, as well as military leaders and political figures. The president delivered a speech acknowledging the bravery of the 761st and emphasizing the importance of remembering the full scope of American history. James was asked to speak again, this time addressing the nation. Standing behind the presidential seal, he felt the gravity of the moment. "We've come a long way in recognizing the sacrifices of those who've been forgotten," he said. "But this isn't just about the past. It's about how we move forward. It's about building a country that values every story, every voice, and every contribution." The audience gave him a standing ovation. As the event wound down, James and Madison found themselves standing together in a quieter corner of the room. Madison looked around, taking in the grandeur of the occasion. "Can you believe we're here?" she asked, a hint of disbelief in her voice. James smiled. "It's a long way from that plane ride, isn't it?" Madison nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I never imagined this would be my path, but I'm glad it is." Despite the celebratory atmosphere, a new challenge was on the horizon. As public interest in the 761st story grew, so did questions about other military units and communities that had been marginalized throughout history. Advocacy groups began pushing for a broader investigation into systemic erasure and discrimination in the armed forces. James was approached by one such group, who asked him to lend his voice to their efforts. The cause resonated with him, but he hesitated, knowing how exhausting and polarizing the fight could be. "Do you really want to take this on?" Angela asked him one night. James thought for a moment. "I don't know," he admitted. "But if I don't, who will?" Madison, too, found herself at a crossroads. Inspired by her grandfather's legacy and her journey of self-reflection, she began exploring ways to contribute meaningfully to the ongoing fight for justice. She considered writing a book about her experiences, hoping it might encourage others to confront their own biases and embrace the power of history. As she drafted the first chapters, she realized how much she had grown since that fateful plane ride. She no longer felt defined by her mistakes, but by how she had chosen to learn from them. The push for broader recognition of marginalized groups gained momentum, but it also faced fierce opposition. Senator Caldwell, still embittered by the outcome of the 761st story, launched a campaign to block funding for the proposed investigations. His rhetoric was divisive, framing the movement as an attack on traditional American values. James and Madison watched the developments with growing concern. They knew the stakes were high, not just for the military but for the country as a whole. Once again, they found themselves at the center of a battle for truth and justice. "We've done this before," Madison said to James during a phone call. "We can do it again." James's voice was steady. "We will." As the movement for justice expanded, so did the resistance against it. James and Madison prepared to face new challenges, knowing that their fight was far from over. But they also knew they had something powerful on their side: the truth. The fight for broader recognition of marginalized groups in American history intensified. Public opinion was split, with strong support from advocates and historians, but relentless resistance from political figures like Senator Caldwell. His campaign to block funding for investigations into systemic erasure in the military gained traction in Congress, threatening to stall the movement. James felt the weight of the situation as he read the latest headlines. The momentum they had built for the 761st was inspiring, but it was clear this battle would be harder. He called Claire to strategize. "We need to remind people what this is really about," Claire said. "It's not just about correcting the past. It's about shaping the future. If we let Caldwell control the narrative, we'll lose." James nodded. "Then we fight back the way we know how, with facts and stories that can't be ignored." Meanwhile, Madison was finding her voice in unexpected ways. Her book draft had grown into a deeply personal exploration of her journey, from the ignorance that defined her life before the plane incident to the awakening that followed. She shared excerpts with Claire, who encouraged her to publish it as a memoir. "This could be powerful," Claire said. "You're showing people that change is possible. If you're willing to be vulnerable, it could make a real impact." Madison hesitated. "What if people think I'm just doing it for attention?" "Then let them think that," Claire said bluntly. "The people who matter will see the truth." As James and Madison prepared for the next phase of the fight, Caldwell escalated his attacks. He accused James of exploiting his military service for political gain, and labeled Madison as a privileged opportunist trying to rewrite history. The accusations stung, but James remained focused on the mission. One evening, he sat down with Angela and Kayla to explain why he was continuing to push forward. "This isn't just about me or Madison," he told them. "It's about making sure no one else's story gets erased. It's about teaching people like Kayla that every voice matters." Kayla looked up at him with wide eyes. "Daddy, are you gonna win?" James smiled and kissed her forehead. "I'm going to try my best, sweetie." The turning point came when Claire uncovered a treasure trove of forgotten documents in a military archive. The papers detailed instances of other marginalized units being denied recognition for their contributions. One report described an all-Native American unit that had completed a critical mission during World War II, but received no medals due to racial prejudice. Claire immediately shared the findings with James and Madison. "This is it," she said. "This proves the 761st wasn't an isolated case. This is a pattern." James felt a surge of determination. "We need to get this out there," he said. "People need to see the bigger picture." The documents were leaked to the press, sparking a firestorm of new debates. News outlets covered the revelations extensively, and social media erupted with calls for justice. Caldwell, caught off guard by the overwhelming evidence, scrambled to respond. In an emergency press conference, Caldwell doubled down on his rhetoric. "This so-called movement is tearing apart our nation," he declared. "We should be celebrating our shared history, not dividing ourselves over past mistakes." James watched the broadcast with a grim expression. He knew Caldwell's words would resonate with some, but he also knew the truth was on their side. The pressure on Congress to fund the investigations grew, fueled by public outcry and endorsements from prominent figures. Madison, despite her initial fears, became a vocal advocate, using her memoir as a platform to share her grandfather's story and the lessons she had learned. During a live interview, she addressed Caldwell's criticisms directly. "This isn't about division," she said. "It's about acknowledging the truth and honoring the people who sacrificed everything for this country. If we can't do that, what does that say about us?" Her words resonated, and her bravery earned her new respect from many who had doubted her sincerity. As the movement gained traction, James received an invitation to testify before Congress. The hearing would determine whether funding for the investigations would be approved. It was a high-stakes moment, and James felt the pressure acutely. The night before the hearing, he reviewed his prepared remarks with Angela. "You've got this," she said, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Speak from the heart. That's what you do best." The hearing was tense, with Caldwell and his allies pushing back against every argument presented by James and the other advocates. But James remained calm and focused. When it was his turn to speak, he stood tall and delivered a powerful statement. "This isn't about rewriting history," he said. "It's about writing it correctly. The soldiers we're fighting for gave their lives for this country. The least we can do is give them the recognition they deserve." The room fell silent as his words hung in the air. Even Caldwell seemed momentarily at a loss for words. As the hearing concluded, the committee announced it would take several weeks to make a decision. The waiting period was agonizing, but James, Madison, and Claire continued to rally support, speaking at events and engaging with the public. Finally, the decision came. Congress approved funding for the investigations. It was a monumental victory, but James knew it was just the beginning. That evening, James and Madison met at a quiet cafe to reflect on the journey they had taken together. Madison raised her glass. "To the 761st, she said, "and to everyone who's ever been told their story doesn't matter." James smiled and clinked his glass against hers. "To the truth," he said. But as they celebrated, new challenges loomed. The investigations would uncover more untold stories, stories that would need champions to bring them to light. James and Madison were ready to take on whatever came next. The approval of funding for the investigations was a monumental victory, but it marked the beginning of a new chapter in the fight for justice. Teams of researchers, historians, and advocates began sifting through decades of archives, unearthing stories that had long been buried. James and Madison were invited to play a central role in the project, helping to ensure the voices of forgotten heroes were heard. James saw it as an opportunity to build on the work they'd started with the 761st Tank Battalion, while Madison saw it as a chance to continue honoring her grandfather's legacy. Months passed as the investigations unfolded. Among the stories uncovered was that of the all-Native American unit Claire had found in the archives. Dubbed the Silent Wolves, the unit had executed one of the most dangerous missions of World War II, gathering critical intelligence that had saved thousands of lives. Yet, like the 761st, they had received little acknowledgement. When James read the details of their mission, he felt a familiar sense of anger and determination. "This is just as important as the 761st, he told Claire. "We need to make sure their story is told." Madison, who had been researching other overlooked groups, found herself drawn to the story of a Japanese-American unit that had fought bravely in Europe while their families were held in internment camps back home. "The contradictions are staggering," she said. "They fought for a country that treated them like enemies." The findings were compiled into a massive report, which was presented to Congress and the Department of Defense. The report detailed systemic patterns of discrimination and called for the immediate recognition of dozens of marginalized units. But the report also reignited backlash. Senator Caldwell, now leading a coalition of opponents, accused the investigators of tearing at the fabric of our nation and warned that the findings would rewrite history to fit a narrow agenda. James wasn't surprised by Caldwell's reaction, but he was tired of his rhetoric. During an interview on a national news program, he addressed Caldwell's criticisms head-on. "Senator Caldwell keeps talking about division," James said. "But the real division is pretending some sacrifices matter more than others. The truth doesn't divide, it heals. And if we're serious about honoring the sacrifices of our soldiers, we need to start by telling their stories honestly." The movement gained even more momentum when the president announced a special event to recognize the findings of the investigations. The event would take place at Arlington National Cemetery, where new plaques and memorials would be unveiled to honor the overlooked units. James, Madison, Claire, and their families were invited to attend, along with the families of the soldiers whose stories had been uncovered. For James, it felt like another step toward justice. For Madison, it was a deeply personal moment. The day of the event was both somber and celebratory. The morning began with a wreath-laying ceremony at the tomb of the unknown soldier, followed by the unveiling of a new memorial dedicated to the 761st Tank Battalion and other marginalized units. As the ceremony progressed, James and Madison were invited to speak. James went first, his voice steady as he addressed the crowd. "This isn't just about recognizing the past. It's about building a future where every story matters, he said. These soldiers fought for a country that didn't always fight for them. Today, we take a step toward honoring their sacrifices and ensuring their legacies endure. Madison followed, her voice filled with emotion. My grandfather was one of those soldiers. For years, I didn't understand the depth of his courage or the struggles he faced. But now I know. And I'm proud to stand here today, honoring him and all the men and women who have been forgotten for too long. The audience erupted in applause, and Madison felt a surge of pride and gratitude. She glanced at James, who gave her an encouraging nod. As the event concluded, families of the soldiers gathered around the new memorials, placing flowers and sharing stories. Madison stood in front of her grandfather's plaque, her eyes brimming with tears. "You'd be proud of this, Grandpa," she whispered. "I hope you know how much you mean to me, and to all of us." James watched from a distance, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. The journey they had taken together had been challenging, but moments like this made it all worth it. But just as they began to reflect on their progress, news broke of a new effort to challenge the investigations. A group of lawmakers, emboldened by Caldwell's rhetoric, planned to introduce legislation to limit further funding for historical reviews. James and Madison realized their fight was far from over. The stories they had helped uncover were just the beginning, and they knew more battles lay ahead. "We've come this far," Madison said. "We can't stop now." James nodded, his resolve unwavering. "We won't." The announcement of new legislation aimed at halting further investigations into overlooked military units was a sobering reminder of how deeply entrenched resistance to change could be. For James and Madison, it was a call to action, one final battle to ensure that the progress they had made would not be undone. James spent weeks traveling across the country, speaking at veterans events, schools, and community centers. His message was simple but powerful. The truth matters. He reminded audiences that honoring the sacrifices of all soldiers was not just a moral obligation but a fundamental part of building a stronger, more unified nation. Madison, meanwhile, poured her energy into finishing her memoir. Titled Rewriting the Story, A Journey from Ignorance to Understanding, the book was both a personal account of her transformation and a tribute to the 761st Tank Battalion and other overlooked heroes. Its release sparked renewed interest in the movement, with many readers praising her vulnerability and commitment to change. The book's success also brought Madison unexpected allies. Prominent figures in politics, entertainment, and education publicly endorsed her work, calling on Congress to reject the proposed legislation and continue funding the investigations. As the date for the congressional vote approached, public pressure reached a fever pitch. Protests and rallies were held in cities across the country, with thousands of people carrying signs that read "Every story matters" and "Honor all heroes." Social media campaigns flooded timelines, with veterans and their families sharing their stories of service and sacrifice. James and Madison were invited to speak at a massive rally in Washington, D.C., just days before the vote. Standing before a crowd of thousands, they delivered a united message of hope and determination. "This isn't just about the 761st or any single group," James said. "It's about making sure every soldier, every contribution, and every sacrifice is recognized. We owe it to them, and to ourselves, to get this right." Madison followed, her voice steady despite the enormity of the moment. "We can't change the past, but we can choose how we move forward. Today, we're choosing truth, we're choosing justice, and we're choosing to honor the stories that have been ignored for too long." The crowd erupted in cheers, their energy palpable. James and Madison stood side by side, feeling the strength of a movement they had helped build. The day of the vote arrived, and the nation held its breath. The debate in Congress was heated, with supporters and opponents making their final arguments. James and Madison watched from the gallery, their hands clenched tightly as the votes were tallied. When the results were announced, the chamber erupted into applause. The funding for historical investigations had been secured, and the legislation to block it had been defeated. James exhaled deeply, a wave of relief washing over him. Madison turned to him, her eyes filled with tears. "We did she whispered. No, James said, smiling. We all did it. The victory marked a turning point for the movement. The investigations continued, uncovering even more stories of courage and sacrifice that had been hidden for decades. New memorials were built, textbooks were revised, and families who had long felt overlooked finally saw their loved ones honored. James returned to his life with Angela and Kayla, grateful for the chance to serve not just his country, but the truth. He continued to advocate for justice, though he also took more time to enjoy the peace he had fought so hard to create. Madison, now an author and speaker, found purpose in her work. Her transformation inspired countless others to confront their own biases and embrace the power of understanding history. She visited schools, libraries, and veterans organizations, sharing her story and encouraging others to share theirs. Years later, James and Madison reunited at the dedication of a new museum wing honoring the contributions of marginalized military units. They stood before a display featuring the 761st Tank Battalion, Madison's grandfather's journal at its center. It feels like a lifetime ago, Madison said, her voice filled with emotion. That plane ride, that moment. James nodded. It was the beginning of something bigger than either of us. They stood in silence for a moment, reflecting on the journey they had taken. Then Madison turned to James with a smile. Do you think we've done enough? She asked. James looked at her, his expression calm but resolute. We've done what we could, and that's all anyone can ask. Madison smiled, feeling a deep sense of peace. Then I think we've done all right. As they walked through the museum, surrounded by the stories they had fought to bring to light, they knew their work had made a difference. The truth, once buried, now stood proudly for all to see, a testament to the power of courage, resilience, and the enduring belief that every story matters.